Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Probation and Parole Officer Concerns video lecture. In this lecture, we'll talk about some of the challenges of the community supervision officer position. One of the challenges that officers face is the changing job role. Community corrections is always evolving, influenced by a variety of factors, including new job duties, technology, and changing of public opinion. I want to discuss two of the recent changes in supervision officer roles: risk assessments and technology supervision. The goal of community corrections personnel is to supervise the offender at the lowest level possible while still ensuring public safety. One avenue increasingly used by today's community corrections agencies is the use of risk assessments to monitor high-risk offenders or those offenders who are at most risk for committing a new crime. While risk management has always been a part of probation and parole duties, the form of risk management has changed substantially in the last couple of decades. Historically, clinical risk prediction was used. Clinical predictions rely on officer experience and familiarity with the offender in order to determine who's at high or low risk of recidivism. While clinical predictions can be individualized for each offender, they remain open to subjectivity and are impacted by the officer's experience and personality. This creates a more subjective risk assessment that may not remain stable between officers. What has become more common is the use of actuarial risk prediction systems. These are numerically based instruments that collect offender data compared to known risk factors and then create an offender risk score. This score is then categorized based on validated risk level cutoffs, allowing correctional agencies to target supervision resources towards the highest risk offenders on the caseload. The advantage of actuarial risk assessments over clinical assessment is that actuarial assessments provide a standardized measure of risk, one that can be compared between offenders, and it does not change between officers. Actuarial risk assessments are usually survey format, and they can be done by entry-level personnel with limited training. While some risk assessments are provided to offenders one time only, others are calculated more frequently. As you'll learn in the subsequent video lecture, sex offenders are subjected to actuarial risk assessments on a pretty regular basis, oftentimes monthly, to ensure that the offender is being supervised appropriately within the community. The change in technology has also affected the community supervision officer role. The increase in electronic monitoring and GPS tracking systems have created a need for officers to be able to handle and maintain electronic supervision devices. Officers must be able to use software to monitor offender locations as necessary. Even though the electronic monitor is usually supported by an external company, offenders are likely to reach out to their supervision officers when their tracking equipment malfunctions, and officers should be prepared for some basic troubleshooting. As supervision officers look for ways to cut costs, officers may also be used to ask face-to-face encounters. Using web cameras, secure check-in booths, and other forms of technology, some supervision officers in the United States conduct regular supervision activities over the internet. The photograph on this slide is from a kiosk that's used for low-risk offenders in California. The kiosk requires a unique PIN and fingerprint verification to ensure that the probationer themselves is checking in, and the probationer then answers a series of computer-generated questions designed to monitor their compliance with their supervision conditions. Now, another major concern for community correction officers is burnout. This is an area of extensive research for most criminal justice positions, including community corrections. And I want to share with you some research relating to job stress for community supervision officers. There are 4 different categories of stressors for probation and parole officers. Personal stressors relate to officers and their family. Due to the nature of their job, law enforcement officers often struggle to receive social support from their families. External stressors relating to stress stemming from outside of the supervision agency. For example, the perceived leniency of plea bargains for offenders, the negative public image that supervision officers hold in the community, and the lack of recognition by the media and the public, except in cases where the situation goes bad, are often cited as external stressors that impact the officer's life. Internal stressors are those stress sources from the probation or parole agency itself. For example, the bureaucratic nature of supervision agencies requires officers to complete lots of paperwork, and an insufficient promotion and job reward system means that supervision officers often feel their work is not recognized by the agent's sufficiency. Finally, job-related or task-related stressors are those stressors which present themselves as a result of the normal activities for probation or parole officers. This includes large caseload size that make contacting and keeping up with all offenders more difficult, going into dangerous areas as part of their supervision duties, and officers' difficulties in meeting all of the time demands of their jobs, like report deadlines, in-person contacts, secondary visits, etc. This is a table from Slate and Johnson's research, where they surveyed state and federal probation officers to identify the top stressors of each population. Officers rated each stressor on a 6-point scale, with 0 being not stressful and 6 being very stressful. This chart here shows the top 5 stressors for each population. As you can see, the average state probation officer stress is almost a 5.0, indicating a very high level of stress. Overall, all 5 of the top stressors for state probation officers are higher than the federal probation officers. What's interesting is that the state probation officers also identified more external stressors, such as overall frustration with the criminal justice system and issues with the court system, whereas federal probation officers identified more job-related or task-related concerns, such as too little time to complete their tasks, excessive work, fear of making a mistake, etc. As you can see from the highlighting, both groups of officers identified excessive paperwork and internal stressor as one of the top 5 stressors for their position. White and co-authors did a qualitative study of officer stress, and they identified 3 core stressors. The first was role conflict or role ambiguity, where officers face challenges balancing the supervisory and the rehabilitation aspect of their job. In this officer quote, the officer notes the strain between the need for firmness and the need for flexibility. The officer talks about you have to know when to be authoritarian and know when to hold back a little bit longer and let your client work through something. And the officer maintains a constant awareness that they can either be criticized for being too harsh or too lax because of this mix. The second stressor that they identified was role overload, which relates to the excessive demands of the job. Supervision officers spoke about the inability to complete all of the necessary tasks because of the high caseloads and the excessive paperwork. So in this quote, the officer says he can pull out someone's file because they're higher risk and they want to focus on their supervision and their service needs. And then the 16 stupid things that I shouldn't have to be dealing with all come walking in the door. At the end of the day, I realized that the one person I really should have been spending time with didn't get any time. This frustrates me because, let's face it, those are the cases that potentially are going to blow up in your face. So notice this is that external stress as well, the fear of failure because the community perception of failure is so negative that creates a constant stress. Like, what if this person goes bad? I'm going to deal with blowback from the community. The third conflict they identified was role integrity conflict, where officers felt that they or their duties were disrespected by other criminal justice agents, including judges, attorneys, and other law enforcement officers. This officer quote says, quote, "I find the frustrations generated by the bureaucracy most stressful. As soon as the politics come into play, it drives me nuts. And there's the constant funding crisis and worry about where we're going to get the money for this and how are we going to do that." And that's obviously a very constant thing. The money issue continues to be a big problem. Especially remember that probation is funded by the courts, so it receives the lowest amount of funding as compared to the police and the corrections. So there's always a concern about how much we're funding the community supervision agencies and how high of a caseload they actually have with that limited funding. The main concern with the significant stressors that we just discussed, aside from the decreased job satisfaction, is the role that they play on supervision officers' mental and physical health. The stress of community corrections has been shown to lead to burnout. The exact definition of burnout is hazy, but generally this term describes a disconnection of the officer from his or her work and may involve mental health concerns such as depression, a sense of depletion, or decreased self-worth. Burnout is a serious concern from community supervision agencies because it can damage the officer to offender relationship, it can lower the officer's work quality, it can increase officer turnout, and it can potentially lead to officer suicide or other mental health trauma. So, this is something that a lot of agencies have now been trying to implement policies to help eliminate the burnout or at least address it by offering counseling services, by having some more workload distribution, something along those lines to help lower officer stress. All right, well, this concludes the Probation and Parole Officer Concerns video lecture. Thanks for watching.